Are you strategic? The answer can make or break your business. Welcome to Strategic Minds, the podcast where we'll do a deep dive into conversations with extraordinary leaders and world-class performers to learn how they think, plan, and act strategically. I'm your host, Rich Horwath, author of 8 books on strategic thinking, including my newest book, Strategic. And my vision is to teach the world to be strategic. Now, let's explore Strategic Minds.
We're stuck.
What do we do? I have no idea.
You need a new strategy.
We need a more dynamic strategy.
The strategy?
You have to strategize.
But you won't strategize.
Let's talk a little strategy.
Welcome to Strategic Minds. Today on the show, I'm excited to speak with Sir Lawrence Freedman, a prominent British academic, historian, and strategist, widely recognized for his contributions to the study of military strategy, international relations, and contemporary history. He's Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, where he served as Professor of War Studies for more than 30 years, and where he founded the Department of War Studies, which became a leading center for the study of conflict, security, and strategy. He was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1995 and awarded Commander of the British Empire in 1996, and in 2003 was awarded the Knight Commander of St. Michael and St. George. Sir Lawrence has written a number of influential books, including Future of War, A History, Ukraine and the Art of Strategy, the 4th edition of The Evolution of Nuclear Strategy, and Strategy, A History, which I highly recommend to everyone interested in a foundational understanding of strategy. For those of you viewing, I have a copy here, and we'll certainly include links to Sir Lawrence's books in our show notes so that you can find them there and purchase your copies after the show. Lawrence, thank you so much for being my guest on the show today.
My pleasure.
So let's begin with your origin story. Please share with us where you grew up and how that environment and the people there shaped who you are.
Right. Well, I grew up in the northeast of England, near Newcastle, which is, at the time I was growing up, a sort of declining area of the UK. It would have been built on shipbuilding and mining, what you would call Rust Belt. And Jewish, so combination of a sort of out-of-the-way place and a minority religion. My parents, my father had quite a good war, as they say. He'd been a naval aviator, been in Malta for a while, struggled a bit, I'd say, after the war, like many people did. So it wasn't a particularly affluent upbringing, but it was fine. I was happy. And I got to a grammar school, state educated, and eventually to Manchester University, eventually to Oxford University. My interest in strategy, I think, developed first because I got interested in politics. And again, I always go for the outlier. So I was, my brother, my elder brother, was joined the Liberal Party, which was very much a minority party. And I sort of got it, and then I moved a bit to the left. But I got interested in why all the people I thought ought to succeed didn't. Oh, and all the people who are very heroic and great visions for the future, by and large, failed. So I started to... my first interest in strategy was sort of the gap between people's aspirations and what they're actually able to achieve. And then later on, I developed the military interest, and the two reinforced each other.
Excellent. Thank you for that background. And as far as that gap goes between aspirations and where people are, in the book you cite that there's many different definitions of strategy floating around out there from the research. I'd love to hear your perspective on how strategy really began and how you define it today.
I mean, it goes back to ancient times. I mean, you know, strategy is one of those things that you do without calling it strategy.
Right.
If people at any time are working out how to achieve what they want to achieve, and looking at the means available, they're engaging in strategy. They talked about strategy in Greek times, strategist, the art of the general, and then in Roman. It sort of entered the vernacular again in Europe in the late 18th century, but only by a word that would have been translated in some way as the art of war or something from the Latin, just being left as strategy.
Okay.
And then there were different definitions that developed. I could go on a long time on this, I should warn you. So you may want to interrupt because it's a complex history, because during the 19th century, it was very much a military term, and essentially referred to how you got your forces in position to fight. And then when the fighting started, that was tactics. Towards the end of the 19th century into the 20th, the issue of how you relate the use of armed force to policy became hard to ignore, especially after the First World War. So that's when we get our sort of contemporary definitions of military strategy anyways, being about military means to political ends and the interaction between the two. And then later on in the 20th century, you get civilians coming in with nuclear deterrence, and their ideas, their conceptual ideas, I think migrate into business and organizational theory. I mean, they have their own trajectories as well. So by the time you get to the last 20, 30 years of the 20th century, strategy is being used for all human affairs. Anytime people are trying to go from turn means into ends. So, and I think it's quite interesting the extent to which, by and large, that's the sort of definition that people tend to use these days. There are some fancier definitions around. I've tried mine, mine at sometimes. But actually, all you really need to do to think about strategy is how do you relate ends to means, and recognize that ends. I think the mistake people make is to say it's about how to achieve defined ends, but actually strategy involves thinking about your ends as much as your means, because some things you can't do, or things you never thought you'd be able to do, you suddenly can do, and so on. So it's a dialectical thing. It's about the interaction between the two.
Excellent. And what would you say, as you've looked across these different arenas, the military, the political, the business, what would you say are, if a business leader is trying to develop a good strategy, and oftentimes they do struggle with, is this a real strategy? Are there any characteristics or traits that or criteria that you would say, if a strategy meets this criteria, then, it would be a valid strategy? Any guidance that you can provide there?
Part of my career was I did strategy, and I was in senior management of a university. And looking back, I mean, I think what was successful about it was partly there was more money around, and that makes a lot of difference. It's easier to have a good strategy if you've got resources, much harder if you don't have resources, which is why, incidentally, a lot of the most ingenious strategic thinkers have been underdogs, because they really need to work at it much more. If you've got plentiful resources, you can make mistakes and you can try again. So I think a lot of it was a general sense of what you were trying to do, what you were trying to achieve, but a clear focus on the here and now. I mean, it's wonderful to have great visions about what your organization can look like, but I think I always see it as getting to the next stage. And then when you're at that stage, you get to the stage after that. And it never ends. I mean, I think the thing about strategy is it's a continual process. So I tend to talk about it as a sort of soap opera rather than a 3-act play. You don't suddenly say, now I'm done, because say, you've had just in business, say you've had a successful takeover, you've won that particular thing, but now you've got to work out how you merge the two entities. Then you've got to work out what effect this has had on the rest of the market, and so on. So it never ends, and I think that's why I think of it in terms of stages rather than not a plan. So a plan is, you've got this great destination and you work backwards with a series of steps in sequence, and if you follow those, you'll get to the right place. But it doesn't work like that, because again, the key thing about strategy is you're dealing with other willful beings,
right,
who have their own ideas, their own objectives, often which interfering with your own. So again, it's the interaction that I find most interesting. It gives it its drama, its challenge, rather than just planning. It's not just a plan.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Any common misperceptions or myths that over the years you've seen come up, which maybe prevent people from being more strategic or developing good strategy? Anything that you can think of from a myth or misperception standpoint?
It's not necessarily myth. I mean, the two I've mentioned, that it's a plan, and all you need to do
Right.
have a sort of neat sequence that'll get you to the right place. That's a myth. And to start and work backwards. I mean, I see strategy as something that should work forwards rather than backwards. I think I think that the thing about strategy and practice is that there's a lot of different pressures weighing on the people who make the decisions. I think strategy is very much an executive function. I mean, other people can advise on it, but whole departments devoted to strategy are rarely that strategic. They tend to produce plans. Because I think, again, the good strategist has got to deal with a lot of different pressures. And I think it's recognition with any large organization that there's an inward as well as an outward aspect to it. So that before you can really get going with your big ideas, you've got to make sure your organization is behind you, that you've got the people in place who can do what's necessary, that they're signed up to the project. And so if you fail on that, or if you keep on meeting opposition at home, then you're going to struggle abroad, as it were. I think a lot of a lot of very successful businessmen, some political leaders, can go wrong because they have been successful and they're not then getting the pushback from the people around them. They tend to get themselves surrounded by sycophants and they're not challenged sufficiently. So I think actually the more successful you are, the more challenge you need, because otherwise hubris sets in. And we can all think of political leaders to whom that has happened.
Yes. Yeah, there's a long list there for sure. You mentioned a few moments ago that great strategic thinkers are often underdogs because they have fewer resources. Are there other, as you've studied history and you do a wonderful job in the book Strategy, a History of Going Back and giving very vivid examples of different leaders. As you've looked back through history, both politically, military, and now even business, are there any characteristics that you've noted for great strategic thinkers?
I think great strategists tend to come out of great situations. The same person can be catastrophic in one setting, but brilliant in another. I mean, the obvious person to mention is Churchill. I mean, if Churchill had died from a motor accident in New York in the early 30s, which he almost did, then he'd be remembered as a failed politician who left behind a series of messes. But he was right for 1940. Nelson Mandela is somebody who, if he'd been executed after his trial in 1964, would have been remembered as a failed guerrilla leader who made a hash of it. His time in prison was the making of him as a political leader. He understood that he could do things that nobody else could do, precisely because he was in prison. And therefore, people would excuse the fact that he was reaching out to talk to the apartheid regime. So I think it's matching the people with the situations. But there's obviously talents that come in those circumstances, and I think one of the talents is the ability to provide a sort of compelling explanation of where you are and what you're trying to do. So people may have a very good grasp of the situation, lots of good ideas, but unless they can persuade others to follow, they're going to struggle. So I think great strategists tend to be quite articulate.
Okay, excellent. And one of the things that comes up quite often, you talked about the people developing strategy, the people implementing it, giving people the rationale. As I work with business leaders, sometimes there's a challenge understanding the difference between things like strategy, tactics, stratagem, those three terms. Any tips that you would share with our listeners on the distinction between strategy, tactics, stratagem?
Well, stratagem was a word that was around far long before strategy, with the same origin. So
Okay.
you'll find stratagem in a lot of old dictionaries as a ruse. I mean, and it's what a lot of people think of as strategy as well. Deception,
Yes.
catching the opponent unawares, outthinking them. A bit Sun Tzu-ish, if you like, and it is sort of full of stratagem. And in some of the original thinking in the late 18th century, it was pretty stratagem based. This is what a clever leader would do. The more Prussian views took over, but that's how it started. I think the interaction between strategy and tactics is fascinating because in the 19th century, tactics was more important than strategy because they were the people who that was the actual fighting. I mean, how do you actually beat the enemy? And over time, strategy shifted from worrying about the interaction with tactics to worrying about the interaction with policy, as I described earlier. And I think tactics in the process got rather neglected. It tends to be rather secondary. I mean, my example is lots of people, including once myself, can be a vice president for strategy. You never see a vice president for tactics. I mean, that's considered rather in for a dig. And it's sort of mere implementation. So first, I think bad strategy pays no attention to implementation. And when you are talking about implementation, it's tactics, because you're working out how to make things happen at quite often quite micro level, sometimes more than micro, but it's still a series of encounters. So you think about what you're trying to do with strategy, but you move forward with tactics. I think there's a dangerous disparagement of tactics in the literature as rather secondary. There's this quote which is attributed to Sun Tzu, which appears in so many books, which I'm afraid I use myself, about how you can make great progress just with strategy, but you can't make great progress just with tactics. That's the gist of it. Anyway, it's a completely made up quote. Sun Tzu never said it. Sometime in the 1990s, 2000s, somebody made it up somewhere. It could be Sun Tzu. It sounds like the sort of thing he said. Right. But I think it's part of this disparagement of tactics, which I think is, so the rewards go to the strategists, but actually the business end is tactics. So I have a campaign to make people think harder about tactics, because I think one of the problems is, and it goes back to having strategy departments or planning departments, is they tend to get disconnected from the people who do the work, from the doers. And I think that can be fatal.
Yes, absolutely. Is the quote you're referring to, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory? Yeah, tactics without strategy, noise before defeat. That's interesting that he...
Okay. Look, I used it, and then somebody asked me to find it for them in The Art of War, and I realized I couldn't. And I felt ashamed. But I wasn't unique.
Yes, that's a good tip. I'd be interested, as you look back through military history, there's cases of leaders that have been great strategists for many years, and then towards the end of their career, Napoleon comes to mind, where he wasn't successful. What do you take away in maybe as guidance for business leaders listening to this, or political leaders, on having set great strategy, but then all of a sudden failing to do so? Are there learnings there that you would share with others about preventing that or being wary of that? Well,
partly what I referred to before with hubris. If you're successful, you trust your judgment more and your advisors less. And I always used to make it a point that when I said I was interested in consultation, that meant I had to accept that I could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, when they say they're consulting, it's for form's sake, and everybody knows it is, so they don't actually try very hard. So I always thought it was important, and is important for anybody, to accept that they may be wrong, and somebody's good argument might persuade them to act differently. So I think that's one way of correcting. The problem with Napoleon was, and the problem with authoritarian leaders who combine the political and the military. So there's no doubt Napoleon was an absolutely brilliant general who could see opportunities that others couldn't see. He wasn't a great politician. At least he got worse as time went on. And so he didn't have an idea of an end state of what he was trying to get to. He just, he moved, and the sort of classic failures in Russia in 1812 is a good example of that. He hadn't thought it through. And it points to a difficulty. I don't say it's necessarily criticism, because a chief executive has to be responsible for everything in some way. And, if you have two people doing the job, it often doesn't work because at some point they'll clash and they'll have different ideas. So I think the management of the different dimensions of the problem, in universities in the States and in the UK now, increasingly, you'll have, the president who's outward looking and the provost who looks in, and that can work. But I think there's only so much an individual can do. Yet accountability and responsibility means it often comes down to an individual, and I think that's just a problem. There isn't a simple solution, and some people can manage it, but you tend to play to your strengths. And again, One thing I noticed, sort of as a rule of thumb, is this came from an earlier part of my career when I worked in a think tank, and the boss at any given time spent most of their effort and energy on the things they disliked most. And the reason is because they weren't very good at them. And one of them was a wonderful man, good with people, a fantastic writer, but he was terrible at fundraising. And we needed the money. So the poor chap was spent all his time trying to fundraise, which he wasn't very good at. So we needed to spend more time at it. And I think that can be true of a number of people. If you have these multiple roles, it's often the one you like least that dogs you.
Yes. Great point there. You shared some really interesting things around listening to other perspectives to see if we might change our mind, that being a really helpful one. As you think about the military arena and then transferring over to business, are there any other principles of military strategy that you think potentially could be more prevalent or utilized more in the business arena, as you've seen both over the years?
If you look at why military strategy fails most, it's because of underestimation of your adversaries.
Okay.
And again, we can all think of plenty of examples of that. And that just may be not understanding their strategy, how they might fight. Now, in business, I think competition in business is not the same as war. I think there's always, there's plenty of books, as you know, about how the boardroom can be a war room, and how they should read Clausewitz and so on. And it's always very helpful, but they'll find it quite hard going. But it isn't the same because, normally it doesn't involve violence.
Right.
And the stakes are less. And I think there's more opportunity for cooperation and even with competitors in business. So it's not quite the same. But I think understanding others, this could be your allies as well as your adversaries, is a good start for almost any strategic enterprise. I mean, you need to understand your own organisation, which often leaders don't. But you certainly need to make an effort to understand your opponents, and that's not just a question of good intelligence. It's also empathy and so on, and because then you can anticipate how they're likely to respond to things that you're likely to do. And if you don't think about that, you can get surprised. So I think that's the main takeaway. I mean, I think the hardest thing. Another thing with military strategy is knowing when to stop, which again is something that I don't think successful businesses always know how to do. And there is an argument that U.S. antitrust laws, in some ways, were quite helpful because they not only stop monopolies, but they force businesses to become more ingenious in the areas in which they were allowed to control. If you just keep on accumulating, then you'll overextend yourself. I was just reading about a chap called Fred Goodwin, who was the head of the Royal Bank of Scotland, who more or less single-handedly broke the British economy with in the financial crisis, because he'd been in this sort of acquisition spree and created this massive international bank, which he just couldn't sustain. And at the first sign of trouble, it struggled. So I think if you do read Clausewitz, he's very clear as keeping to your objectives and not getting distracted. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. When you're on a roll, there's a tendency to keep going without thinking about whether or not you're going to acquire more than you can cope with.
Lawrence, you've mentioned a few times in our conversation the importance of context or situation, the right leader for the right situation, the right time. You mentioned Clausewitz several times here in the last few minutes. In his book on war, he talks about the fog of war from a military context. Perhaps you can explain to our listeners a little bit about what the fog of war meant from a military perspective, and then how business leaders might think about that concept in trying to run a successful organization.
Yeah, I think it's one of his best, most useful concepts. And it's about friction. And obviously, he's thinking about armies going over terrain. The weather may change. It gets boggy. Your map's not very good, and what you thought was a stream turns out to be a river, or there's a mountain, and by the time you reach the mountain, your people are exhausted, and so. I mean, it's all the little things that can go wrong. There's a great line of Clausewitz is in war, everything is very simple, but the simplest things are very complicated. And I think it's a reminder that it can affect anything. It's particularly true in armed conflict, that it's the stuff that you can't account for in your planning that'll trip you up. And so friction or fog of war is another way of talking about. There's just stuff you don't understand, you can't know. And in fast-moving situations, you can suddenly get caught out. And people, of course, assume now that won't happen because, after all, we've got the internet, we've got AI, we've got amazing sources of information, and they're all on here. But, that's fine until the internet goes down. Or the electricity's cut off, or whatever, and then all of a sudden you're totally in the dark. So in some ways now, we maybe risk being even worse situations because you're so dependent upon all these incoming sources of information and all the algorithms sorting it all out for you, that if you lose them, you've lost the old skills that would have helped you find your way without. So it never goes away, this problem. It's always going to be there. And of course, you've got information overload now as well. There's so much coming in, what to trust, what not to trust.
in the beginning of that comment, you painted a nice picture of the idea of terrain, as you described the fog of war terrain. In the military arena, terrain seems fairly understandable. The ground that you're covering, the mountain ranges, the streams and rivers. How could potentially corporate leaders think about terrain and navigating terrain from a business perspective?
I mean, I think, I'm not a business leader, so I don't want to claim knowledge of things of which I'm dimly aware. But I think a lot of good business leaders or people who rise to the top are either accountants or engineers. And they know how to make things, and they know how to read a balance sheet, and that's absolutely essential in many businesses. What they often have less understanding of or can get quite impatient about is the regulatory environment, the political environment, shifts in public opinion, the working practices of people with who they have to deal with, who are quite different. Again, going back to my university management time, one of my jobs at one point was startups from the university. So I dealt a bit with some businesses then. And the culture clash is extraordinary because you have these sort of dreamy academics who get very excited about their discoveries and very suspicious, therefore, of businessmen. And you suddenly realize they've also got no idea of what it takes to turn their brilliant discoveries into real assets.
Yes.
And they worry about the wrong things and so on. So it's actually the ability to understand just different cultures. Higher education is very different from business.
Yes.
Which is different from the military, which is different from politics, which is different from the law, and so on, though they all interact and rub off each other in some way. Successful organizations, I think, understand that and are sort of not patronizing. They know how to and see how things look from others' point. Yeah, I think it comes back to what I was just saying before. I think success in most of these things requires a degree of empathy and understanding where others come from. And if you don't have that, you're just likely to get them wrong and make mistakes and fall out over nothing.
Yes. And when you think about terrain, you referenced Sun Tzu earlier, and in The Art of War, Sun Tzu talks a little bit about maneuver in terrain. And I think that's a concept from a business perspective that we don't see hear and talk about a lot, is the idea of maneuver and what that really means to a good leader, a good strategist. Could you share with us your perspective on the art of maneuver, or what maneuver could mean from a business context?
So it's an interesting argument, and it goes right back. Well, you can see it through the history of military strategy, going back to Roman times. And it was sort of captured in the British strategist Little Hart in terms of direct and indirect approaches to strategy. So the direct approach, which he'd seen firsthand in the First World War, was charging at the enemy, which, if you've got a lot more than the enemy, may work. But otherwise, you just see a lot of your people killed. So he didn't think that was a good idea. So he wanted to find ways of maneuver. And as he was sort of coming in, tanks were the new innovation. So armored warfare allowed you to maneuver, so come at the enemy from unexpected directions and move quickly.
Okay.
And you see that I think quite a lot of business leaders at times have picked up that idea of an unexpected direction, catching rivals, competitors by surprise, which may require traveling a greater distance rather than going the most direct route. And I think that's essentially what maneuver means. Interestingly, I think there's more skepticism in the military side about maneuver now, in part because it's just becoming harder. And you can see that in Ukraine. You're just not seeing big offensives breaking through and traveling distances. Haven't really seen that for a couple of years in the war. they really only happen properly, with some exceptions, in 2022. And it's because you're being watched all the time
Yes.
with drones and so on. So, and also it tended to pose a rather false dichotomy with attrition. So that's what happens when you sort of charge straight at the enemy, which the Russians still do, and you just lose a lot of people. But actually, all war is going to be attritional to a degree,
Sure.
and it's all going to use up resources. So, and of course, a lot of the people who spoke excitedly about manoeuvre as the way of warfare would cite the German blitzkrieg without actually remembering that Germany in the end lost the war, because
Right.
in the end
Yes.
it only took it so far. And it goes back to another problem, which this is just sort of lessons one can learn. The big failure of a lot of military strategy, and I suspect business strategy as well, is to assume everything depends on the first moves. And that if you catch them by surprise, and if you move quickly and win, have a decisive victory, then it's all great. And of course it is. If you move quickly and have a decisive victory, it's super. But if the enemy manages to stop you and hold you up, then you're going to get into a long grinding haul, which is what happened to the Russians in Ukraine. And I think because, as I've argued, strategy tends to be about the here and now and the first stage, because you, by necessity, are going to put all your effort into that, you've got to still think about what happens if it doesn't work.
Right.
And I think that's where a lot goes wrong. And so, you may make a big bid for another company, say, and you think it's a pretty eye-watering sum, but it's not enough. And do you back down, or are you obliged at that point to go on? Unless you've thought about whether or not you're going to do that, you may find yourself unprepared for the choices you've got to make. So I think part of the, it's criticism I've had of me with my sort of focus on the here and now and the first stages, that surely you've got to have an idea of where you're getting to. And I think you do need that. And you've got to try and think more than one stage ahead. It's all contingent. The longer you're thinking ahead, the more contingent it is on the success of the earlier stages.
Yeah, a lot of great things you said there. I want to unpack one of them, which was, when things don't go well or things go wrong. And interestingly, you open up your book with the quotation from Mike Tyson that everybody has a plan till they get punched in the mouth, which I think he took from von Moltke about 100 years earlier.
I doubt if he read, but von Moltke said the same thing. No plan survives contact with the enemy. I would love to think that Mike Tyson was a student of 19th century Prussia, but
Right. So from a business perspective, as we think about that concept, and you just alluded to, strategy being in the here and now, thinking, but the need to think contingently. What would the guidance be that you'd share with people on preparing for different outcomes than maybe they were expecting based on the plan? And you talked about strategy isn't a plan because strategy is going to be more iterative than a plan. How would you counsel people on that ability to improvise or to do things differently when things aren't going well?
I think first I guess it's intellectual. I mean, being prepared to improvise, understanding what that might mean, and preparing the ground for it. The government in the UK has got itself in a bind because it said before the election that it wouldn't raise the basic taxes, and then it finds itself with a fiscal deficit. Now, if it had prepared the ground by saying, well, until we see the books, we can't tell you what we're going to do, it would be in a much better position now.
Yes.
And so I think preparing the ground, and it's difficult because you don't want to say we're now going to embark on a course of action, which may fail because that's not necessarily good for morale. But people who are responsible have got to think through that. Secondly, I think it's keeping something in reserve, I guess. It's having resource that's not committed, that you can deploy as and when needed. I think it's third, being prepared to retreat, which people are surprisingly bad at. Because as soon as you're committed to a course of action, it reflects on you if you have to reverse. It shows you've made a bad decision, it'll cost, and it may indeed be fatal to your political career or whatever. But carrying on may just make it worse. Doubling down may make it worse. And also, it's just struck me, just in managing disputes within a university, when I spent the easiest thing, the cheapest thing to do is to apologize. Maybe you did get it right, and maybe they just misunderstood, but actually they'll be very pleased. It won't harm you, and you'll get over it. But people dig in, and as soon as you think everything's a matter of honor, that everything's ego, then you can't get out of some bad situations. But I just think for military, governments, businesses, it's a really hard thing to do, to say we got this wrong. And if you do it, you do. I mean, Zelensky in Ukraine just made a pretty poor move. People went on the streets. He put his hands up. We made a poor move on corruption. So he's rowing back. And so he'll get over it. If he dug his heels in, he would have had a real problem. And I think people deserve credit when they recognise they've made a mistake and try to rectify it, rather than assume any admission of mistake, any admission of fallibility is going to make it much harder to operate in the future. I actually think Americans are better at that than others. But it is a problem of not knowing how to, and go back, I said before, you've got to be able to admit you were wrong, and you didn't get it right. And the quicker and easier you do that, the more you can rectify situations. Obviously, you want to be, most of the time you want to, if you keep on being wrong, it's not a recommendation. It's not, it doesn't reflect well on you. But if you're occasionally wrong, it just shows you're human.
Yes. Well, let's build on that a little bit. One of the questions I receive oftentimes from business leaders is, how do we know when we should change our strategy? To your point, maybe we were wrong in setting this direction for the strategy. Any counsel you would share with people on, reversing course on strategy? Are there things to look for to say, maybe this strategy isn't the right strategy, we've made a mistake, let's change course?
Well, I think it's always worth asking, how will we know that this is succeeding? What are the vital indicators we're looking for? And if you can't see them, and there's not even a flicker, then you need, and it may not be a sort of complete reversal or anything, you just may need to tweak or to be less ambitious or something. It doesn't, I don't think it's always, it's quite difficult to swap one strategy for another. I mean, you've got everybody geared up, and then you have to say, sorry, folks, it's plan B. That can be quite difficult and demoralizing. I think you have to do it now and again, but it's often easier to tweak. And again, the earlier you can do this, the better. And I think it partly involves of not boxing yourself in too much, so you've got some flexibility. But I think these are trade-offs. If you exhibit too much flexibility, and if you show that all the time things aren't going quite right, you'll fiddle a bit, and then people can also lose confidence for that reason. I mean, at some point, you've just got to keep on going because you've got to have confidence that in the end it will work out. And that, I think, is, when we look back, it's often sort of the great leadership has sufficient confidence that even when the vital indicators aren't great, they'll keep on going largely because the alternative's going to be much worse.
Yes.
And again, I'm sorry, I keep on coming back to Ukraine. The reason that the Ukrainians keep on going is because they know what Russian occupation means. So even when things are difficult, they'll keep on going. without necessarily a clear view of how they're going to win. But the alternatives are worse. So I think there's no formulas in a lot of this. It is about reading situations and reading people and what the alternatives are. Sometimes you're just stuck with a strategy, and you've got to make the best of it.
Yeah. And to that point, with the strategy, as you've observed leaders in different arenas, are there any common tools, techniques that people use to develop strategy to get that first mover advantage? Anything you've observed that this is a tool or technique that a great leader had used to actually develop their strategy?
I'm not sure. I think people are very different in how they do it, and sometimes there's no time because somebody else has taken an initiative. I mean, a lot of the time when people write about strategy, they assume you've got all the time in the world to work it all out and then implement it. Whereas the fact that some other so and so has taken the initiative and caught you flat-footed, that requires you to really think. A matter is often the biggest challenge is because you're on the defensive. Most strategy, or not, let's say 50% of strategy is defensive, and that's not. I don't know how much that's taught in business schools, but that's the way in practice a lot of it's going to work because you're just being caught out. So it's the ability to read situations, and a lot of that is quite intuitive. Especially when you don't have a lot of time, argue it comes with age and wisdom. Doesn't necessarily follow that age produces wisdom, but anyway. So I think reading situations, anticipating what others are going to do, bringing other people with you, knowing how to articulate it, so people can see the point of it, and understand where you're trying to go. Although there's the strategist, so the early strategist book is Thucydides, Peloponnesian Wars, and Thucydides was a great fan of Pericles, and Pericles could persuade people of almost anything. So he could lay out what turned out to be a pretty disastrous strategy for Athens, and everybody cheered and followed. So it doesn't do it necessarily to be too eloquent and too persuasive an advocate if you're pushing your luck in your advocacy. But it is important to be able to explain what you're trying to do. And then people know their part in it. There's a phrase in the military of mission command. And mission command is you're going to be in situations where we can't give you orders. So you need to know what it is we're trying to do, the commander's intent, normally expressed as. And that, I think that's true in business as well. You can't micromanage everything. So you've got to be able to explain to people what it is you want out of particular situations and leave it up to them to get it. And again, yes, we haven't talked about, but delegation and so on is another hard part of management and strategy.
One final thing I'd love to get your thoughts on is the idea of competitive advantage. And, in the last few years, there's even been books written saying, this is the end of competitive advantage. Things are moving too quickly. There's no sustainable competitive advantage. What's your perspective on competitive advantage in today's world? And do you think that's a realistic goal for business leaders?
Yeah, I mean, so, the United States has got competitive advantages because of geography, because of its energy resources, its food resources, hopefully still its universities. All of these things give the US a competitive advantage, the size of its economy, before you start. Other countries, have got to create them. Dubai has managed to create competitive advantages out of nothing, except money, which it invested and created. Singapore did something similar. So I mean, I think it's possible. Some of these are endowed naturally. Some of these you've got to work at. And then you go back to Michael Porter and barriers to entry and so on. Some, you can see with microchips at the moment, the most advanced microchips are very difficult, and somebody can't suddenly get into them. So over time,
Right.
maybe they will. But one of the advantages of growing to a certain age is that you can remember things that seem terribly important in the past that no longer seem very important, and the assumptions made about what would be the next big thing, which turned out to be wrong, and so on. But certain things are always going to be there. Certain needs are always going to be there, and those that meet them well will continue to prosper. And and again, a lot of the advantages can still be in sort of intellect and drive, and just the ability to operate quickly and efficiently. And when they can go, I mean, you can lose a brilliant chief executive and it all fails. But I don't think we should have a council of despair on these things. It'd be quite. We've had just something that actually I didn't put in the. I regret that isn't much in my book on strategy. Is the big tech firms. There's a whole series of companies that weren't around at the turn of the century, or barely around. They were around. They came in 80s, 90s, and just basically somebody had a good idea and pursued it, and it was such a good idea. By the time others realised, they couldn't catch up. And the other interesting thing about those companies is they totally ignored the management theories of the time. If you think about them, because it was all about, if you recall, it was all about flat hierarchies and so on, and widespread consultation and so on, and these were all led by egomaniacs. I mean, with big ideas who trampled over competition and rivals and so on, but had the drive to see it through. That's why I said there's no formula in any of this.
Yes. Well, Lawrence, I'd be appreciative if we could close our conversation with your brief responses to 6 questions that I call the strategic 6, just so our listeners can get to know you a little bit better from a personal perspective. Okay? So number 1, what was your first job?
Delivering newspapers, I guess.
Okay. Very good. How about your favorite vacation spot?
I have a place in the south coast of England, Sussex, which is tranquil and peaceful, and I don't have any administrative burdens there. So I always feel very relaxed. Otherwise, I find myself going to Italy quite a lot.
Yes, wonderful. And number 3, what's the one word that best describes you?
Oh God. I should ask my wife on that. What's the one word that best describes me? I think I'm quite affable.
Affable. Okay. Excellent. I would agree with that based on our conversations. How about number 4? What one book has had a significant impact on your development?
Well, I mean, when I went to Oxford to do my doctorate, I was a chap called Michael Howard, became Sir Michael Howard, became my supervisor, and I was vaguely aware of him but never read anything by him. So I bought a book of his essays called Studies in War and Peace, and I started reading it, and I didn't put it down till I'd finished. By the end of the reading, I decided that's what I wanted to do. I mean, he's more of a historian, I was more of a political scientist beforehand. But I just thought, I want to be able to do this, write in this sort of way. So that, I mean, in terms of sort of just a transformational moment, and it is a great book, I think that was probably it.
Excellent. Number 5, what's one piece of advice that you'd like to share with others?
The best piece of advice I was given was, if you want to get something done, don't let your ego get in the way. That is, you've got to be able to you've got to take satisfaction out of others' successes, and not worry about whether your contribution is always recognized if you want to get things done.
Very helpful. And number 6, what's the most exhilarating moment that you've experienced in your professional life?
Well, I've been quite a number. I mean, I've been quite lucky in that I've dabbled in lots of things. I mean, management and working with policymakers and so on. There was a moment in December 1984 when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister and Mikhail Gorbachev was coming for a visit. And and a few people were invited in to discuss what was likely to happen. I was a very minor participant in all of this, because the most interesting contributors were talking about the Soviet economy and how bad it was. But just watching her lap it all up as she was told about how bad the Soviet economy was, and the possibilities with Gorbachev, I did actually feel that this was participating in an important moment. You just had that feeling at the time. I was also, I mean, it's the other thing, I was in Poland in 1981, just before the crackdown on Solidarity. And that was just an extraordinary time as well, just a sense of political upheaval and discovery and so on. So, but I mean, I've been lucky. I've without having great responsibilities, I've, say, dabbled in lots of things.
Well, those are wonderful windows into your life. So we appreciate you sharing those. And Lawrence, really appreciate you being my guest today. You've given us a lot of great tools, tips, and techniques to help all of us be better strategists, both in our professional and personal lives. So thank you so much for being my guest on the show today.
It's been a pleasure.
What are we talking about? Practice?
Practice makes perfect. Practice makes
Profit.
Welcome to Practice Makes Profit. More than 50% of executives are highly dissatisfied with the meetings they attend. One way to attack this issue is to develop a meeting audit. A meeting audit is simply an inventory of the meetings that you're attending. And what we do is we list all of those and think of a chart. So in the left column, list the meeting name. Next to that, we're going to list the type of meeting. Is this a staff meeting? Is it an all teams meeting? What type of meeting is it? Then we want to list the purpose. You'd be amazed how often I ask teams, what's the purpose of this meeting? And over time, it tends to lose that purpose. So we want to identify the purpose. Next, we want to identify frequency. Is this daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly? So what's the frequency? Then what's the length of the meeting? Is it 30 minutes, 60 minutes, several hours? And then, do we want to keep this meeting? So we want to really think about, are there other meetings as we look at our full audit that would accomplish the same thing, that we could combine? Do we want to cut this from a monthly meeting to a quarterly meeting? Do we want to cut it from 60 minutes to 30 minutes? So what would be the proposed changes for the meeting? So again, I highly recommend all of us take a meeting audit at least once a year to diagram what are the meetings that we're currently attending, what type of meetings, what's the purpose, the frequency, the length, and then what would be some of the proposed changes. If we do that, we're going to give ourselves a lot of time back in our calendar.
I appreciate your strategic mind.
Must have a strategic brain.
Great strategic minds of tomorrow right here.
In this segment, The League of Strategic Minds, I answer questions submitted by listeners. Today's question: what are the keys to leading a strategic meeting? Well, there are a number of keys to leading a strategic meeting. The first is, what's the purpose or the agenda for the meeting? Oftentimes, people are attending meetings where there's no agenda. And I'd recommend that the agenda and the purpose of the meeting be clearly called out and given to people at least 48 to 72 hours before the meeting. This allows people to determine, do I even need to be in this meeting? Am I going to gain value or be able to provide value to the meeting? I also recommend that you send out pre-work, and this can be as simple as 1 or 2 questions to stimulate people's thinking. Perhaps it's a video, an article, maybe a brief audio, but give some people food for thought as to what the meeting's going to be about. And again, questions are really helpful. Then think about, what's the format of this meeting? Are we making decisions in this meeting? Is it informational? And again, if it's informational, do we really need to have a meeting? Is this something where I could shoot a 1 or 2 minute video of the information and then allow people to listen to it asynchronously so that they're not in a meeting? We need to remember that a meeting is defined as a collective interaction of 2 or more people. So if you're leading a strategic meeting, that means that you should have lots of questions, lots of interaction. Nobody should be speaking for more than 50% of the time. And then as we finish the meeting, we should be taking time to gather insights, our learnings that lead to new value. So what are our key takeaways from the meeting? And then what are the action steps and accountability for those action steps for everyone in that meeting? So if we follow those, that can be good criteria for leading a strategic meeting. If you have a question you'd like answered, visit the Strategic Minds page on the website strategyskills.com and complete the brief submission form. If your question is selected, you'll receive some strategic swag for your contribution.
Any insights?
You play to win the game.
Any further insights?
You don't play to just play it.
Insightful.
I want winners.
I played the game to win.
I want people that want to win.
It's very insightful.
To close today's show, our Winsight, or idea for advantage, comes from Michael Porter, professor at Harvard Business School, who said, "It's healthy for people to disagree, and managers should be given a chance to state their case and to change minds. But there comes a time when the discussion has to end. It's not about democracy or consensus or about making everyone happy. Fundamentally, it's about picking a direction and getting everybody really excited about it." When you meet with your team, is it clear who owns what decisions? Are your leaders confident enough to gain input and then make a decision, even if everyone isn't agreeing? If not, time is being wasted and talent is going to eventually leave. Be decisive or be mediocre. If your team lacks a common language and understanding of strategy, is too reactive and tactical, or would like new tools and techniques for strategic thinking, visit strategyskills.com, where you can learn more about strategy workshops, online courses, and sign up for the free Strategic Thinker newsletter. Pick up a copy of my newest book, Strategic, and take your leadership development to the next level by subscribing to the Strategic Fitness System, an innovative, state-of-the-art leadership development platform. If you've enjoyed this episode and found some value, we'd be really appreciative if you take a few moments and give us a 5-star review and potentially a few comments on the podcast player so that we can continue to try to bring as much value and interest to you as possible. Remember, be strategic to be your best.